Well, now we've come to Unit 8, and in chapter 21, we have the birth of Isaac. The first portion of the chapter, it's kind of interesting when you look at, one thing that's interesting to examine in any given text is how much material is given by the writer, the narrator, Moses telling the story. We're given a lot about the background and the upcoming birth of Isaac and God's promise to bring it forth, but 8 verses outline the birth of Isaac in chapter 21. But here, again, in Unit 8, chapter 21, finally, the fulfillment of God's amazing promise to provide a son to the very elderly Abraham and Sarah. Though, in the intervening material, several challenging scenes unfold. We are told at the end of, again, our Unit 7 material about the sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in those intervening chapters, then, between Genesis 18, verse 20, 21, following, all the way through chapter 20 and verse 18, first, God reveals to Abram the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we have this very interesting interplay. One of the fascinating studies is Abraham pleading with God on behalf. Later on, we'll see in a similar occasion, but with more success, you might say, Moses pleading with God when he has suggested the possibility of destroying Israel when they're unfaithful. But again, Moses prays for the people. But in the material we have with regard to God in his interchange with Abraham, as Abraham pleads with him on behalf of these sinful cities, Abraham he knows as a person of faith that God can deliver. He could bring, like the story of Jonah at Nineveh, he could bring redemption at Sodom and Gomorrah. But the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was great. Very area, of course, where his nephew Lot is residing. And so, like Lot was rescued by Abram in chapter 14, God is going to enable the departure of this relative and his family, his daughters and company, to escape the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But in the second phase of this intervening material, the experience of God's messengers in the Twin Cities evidences the character, the deep, dark sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah, necessitating their judgment, which would then, of course, befall the city, as we have described in that chapter. But, of course, in the third phase of this intervening material, God remembers Abram's family, namely Lot and his daughters are delivered, though his wife would die. They are delivered from that destruction, only then to commit sexual sin, sexual immorality, with the scheming daughters in the aftermath of the destruction. So we have, again, one of those recurring themes throughout the book of Genesis, the continuous sinful nature of humanity and God's handiwork, that even through this situation, nations would be brought forth. So there's kind of an interesting tension going on in the text between this immorality, but immorality with these two daughters of Lot would bring forth more nations. So God is able to use even despicable circumstances to bring about the fulfillment of his promises. That, by the way, is a fascinating theme that you're aware. I did a lot of work in the book of Numbers back in the 1990s, early 2000s, with several different projects, including a commentary in the book of Numbers. And one of the great redemption stories of the book of Numbers is God's continued faithfulness in spite of Israel's unfaithfulness. God will accomplish his goals, his blessing, even when the most faithful, honorable followers fail. The great story of God's utilizing Balaam this international divination prophet and expert in manipulating the gods of the heavens as they were interpreted by the Mesopotamian religion. Balaam is used by God to be his spokesman, his prophet, when Moses has failed, striking of the rock, rebelling against God at the rock, as it's described there in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. In spite of Moses' sin, God will use another instrument, even an instrument who is totally out of the realm of one who would walk faithfully and blamelessly before God. But there's a fascinating use of the terminology of divine speech and how God uses even a pagan divination expert to proclaim blessing upon his people Israel. In spite of his being called by the king Balak of the Moabites to curse Israel, God is able to turn the prophet on his head and bring about blessing instead of cursing. God is able to utilize, as he does throughout history, the story of Rahab, Judah and Tamar, and then all the way down the story of Ruth, bringing in outsiders, pagans, into his goal of blessing the nations. And of course, as we know, with Rahab and with Ruth, both in the lineage of David and hence in the lineage of Jesus. But God again interviews in the life of a foreign leader on behalf of Abraham, a local tribal king. Abram, one more time, as we read there in the chapter 20, as Abraham tries to pass off Sarah again, like he did in Egypt, the latter part of chapter 12. The same Abraham who defeated the kings of Mesopotamia, chapter 14, is now afraid of a local king, Abimelech. But God intervenes. Like he did with Pharaoh, God prohibited Pharaoh from bringing Sarah fully into his harem. He likewise intervenes in the mind and heart of Abimelech to bring about the deliverance of Sarah from this waywardness of Abraham. But Abraham amazingly is blessed again, like he was in Egypt, in spite of his waywardness. The amazing thing when we look back at the nature of God and his promises, that so often, in spite of our unfaithfulness, God blesses us anyhow. In the end of the scene, Abraham prays for Abimelech, and the king's family is restored. Abraham is used by God to bless Abimelech. So the story of God's handiwork and redemption is brought forth.